Okay, so we'll continue where we left off last time. Okay, so we were talking about logical clocks, specifically Lamport's clocks and vector clocks. The motivation for using logical clocks as opposed to physical clocks was that clock synchronization is always a problem, and there's always some inaccuracy in clock synchronization. So the question was, can we do away with the need for having physical clock synchronized and yet be able to reason about events? Okay? In scenarios where you don't actually need the real time at which an event occurred, all you're using is the timestamp to compare the ordering of events. Logical clocks are more suitable, okay? And they give you nice properties. The only property we used was to uh, ensure that events can be ordered by using sending and receiving of messages. Okay, so messages can only be received after they're sent, very obvious property. But if you use this property to reason about what's happening locally within each process and across processes, you can figure out ordering on events. Okay? Vector clocks allow us to get a bidirectional implication where the timestamps imply ordering and the ordering implies a sort of increasing timestamps. Okay, so that was a property we used. Towards the end of the class, I was talking about global state of a distributed system, and I said a global state is essentially of a computation is the state of each local process, or the local state of each process, and all the messages in transit. I mentioned this notion of a consistent cut, where I said if these processes checkpoint their state and we do not have a physical synchronized clock, and then processes checkpoint at arbitrary times, as is denoted by the dotted line, we want to ensure that this cut or this checkpoint is consistent, and this is done by capturing every message that's in transit. So no message can be lost or no message can appear twice. Okay, this was an example here where a message essentially was processed twice. Once before the checkpoint was taken, it was resent after the checkpoint by the sending process and got processed again. We want to avoid such situations. Okay? So entire messages can be either on the left side of the cut or right side of the cut, or if a message crosses the cut, the send has to be on the before and the receive has to be on the after, which means it's in transit. Okay, so we now want to look at an algorithm to derive a consistent cut, a snapshot of processes. Okay. The algorithm is actually very simple. Okay, so we will assume that processes communicate with one another using bidirectional channels. Okay, and we will just assume that these could be just TCP connection. Okay, TCP connection is bidirectional. We will also assume that there is no message reordering. Right? If a process sends two messages on a TCP channel, that's the order in which they are received. That TCP gives that to you automatically. You don't have to worry about it. But that's an assumption. There says no reordering. Okay? The send order is the same as the receive order on this channel, which could be a TCP channel. Okay? The algorithm is straightforward. Okay, so we'll assume that any process in this distributed set of processes can initiate a checkpoint. Right? And the way it initiates the checkpoint is it first takes its local state and puts it on disk. It writes it out to disk. Okay? So that's basically any memory state that you need to restart this process. Okay? So you can take an entire snapshot of memory, put it on disk, or you can copy only the critical data structure. How it decides what state needs to be copied to disk is left to the application. We'll not worry about it. We'll just assume that anything that this process needs to restart from this intermediate point has to be returned to disk. Okay? So that's the checkpoint local state. Okay? And then what this process does is it sends a marker message, a marker packet on every outgoing TCP channel. Okay? And then it starts recording every incoming message and writes a copy to disk. Okay? So it's very straightforward. Any process can initiate a checkpoint. To initiate a checkpoint, it will copy its memory state to disk and it will send marker messages. Marker messages are simply messages that say a checkpoint has started. Okay, so just send a message saying a checkpoint has started, which we'll call a marker message on every active TCP connection. Okay, so this is every outgoing channel. Okay. And then on every incoming channel, every message that is coming in on a socket, you just write a copy to disk. Okay, we will call these messages in transit. Okay. Now this process has started the snapshot, so other processes are now going to start receiving these marker messages that it has sent out. Okay. So on receiving a marker message, what the process does is as follows. If this is the first marker message it has received for this checkpoint, okay, it is going to then copy its local state to disk. Okay. So this is the first time it's heard that a checkpoint has started, so you have to take your memory state and copy it to disk. And you repeat the same thing. You send a marker message on every outgoing channel, okay, and start recording messages on your incoming channel until a marker message has been received. Okay, so you start recording messages, and once you get a marker channel on the way back, you will stop recording on that channel. Okay? And at the end of this process, you will have a consistent checkpoint, a consistent snapshot. Okay, so I'll illustrate this process with, let's say, 3 processes. Okay? It is, so I will also mention that it's not assumed that every process in the system has a TCP connection as every other process. Okay? You may have arbitrary number of connections with arbitrary subsets, but the graph as a whole is connected because these processes are all communicating with one another. So here, let's just assume that these are the 3 processes and they are 2 TCP connections. That's how they are talking to one another. Okay. Let's say the process, let's call them A, B, and C. Okay. Process A is going to initiate a checkpoint. It's going to write its memory state to disk. Okay. So it just takes its entire memory snapshot, writes it out to disk, and then it sends a marker message on its outgoing channel. There's only one connection it has, and so it's going to send a marker message to B, and any messages that are beginning to arrive, okay, once it sends this, are also going to be stored on disk. Okay, so a copy of this, all of these messages that are received on the socket, you start copying them over to disk. Okay. When B receives this marker message, it's going to repeat. Okay. It's going to take its memory state and put it to disk. Okay. It is going to send marker messages on all its outgoing channels. It has 2. So it's going to send a marker message this way and a marker message this way. Okay. And then it starts recording messages that are coming onto its incoming channel. Okay. Until it receives a marker message. And then once this marker message arrives at C, it's going to do the same thing. Copy it into disk and send a marker message out in the outgoing channel. Okay. So that's basically how the algorithm works. Now we have to convince ourselves that this is going to capture the local state of each process and all the messages in transit. Okay. So first thing you have to ask, is this ever going to stop? Because each process is basically sending messages on all of its outgoing channels. The computation actually has to stop. The checkpoint process has to converge and terminate. The first thing is, will this ever terminate?
Yes.
So you should convince yourself that it will terminate, because you only wait for the first marker message to actually checkpoint your disk and send out markers on your outgoing channel. If you receive subsequent markers, you do nothing. Right? So you may have, as you can see, B will receive 2 markers. The first time it receives it from A, the second time it receives it from C. Right? The second time around, that marker is not going to do anything other than to tell B to stop recording messages received on that socket. It's not going to cause it to again store its local state and restart. Okay, so you do this only once, and if this is a connected graph, okay, each process will receive this once and be done. Okay, so checkpointing of memory state will be done once. The second question is, are you always guaranteed you will receive a marker on your incoming channel so you can stop recording? Okay. First time you receive a marker, you start recording all messages received on a socket, and you do this until you get a marker on your incoming socket. Okay, and that's when you stop. Yes?
So in your example here, when would C stop recording messages?
When would C stop recording messages? That's a good question. We'll turn that around. Okay, so there are two scenarios here. One is C, case of C, the other one is A. Yes.
It is received markers on all the incoming channels.
Okay, so our property is C has to receive markers on all incoming channels. Okay, when does that happen in this scenario? Okay, when it receives the first marker. Okay, so in this case, C is a special case. Okay? It has only one incoming channel, okay, which is the socket connection it has with B. A marker comes on that message, rather on that socket, and that tells C saying start recording. Okay? And then continue recording until you have received markers on all your incoming channels. But there is only one. It's already received that marker. Okay? So the same marker is also going to tell it stop recording. So it really has nothing to do. Okay? So if you have only one socket connection, the first marker that comes tells you start recording and stop recording because there's nothing else is going to come. Okay? B on the other hand, as you can see, has two channels. Okay? The first time it receives a marker from M, it's going to start recording, but then it won't record anything on this channel because it's already received a marker. So the first marker is telling it to start and stop for this socket. But for this other socket, it sends a marker and it has to wait for that marker to reach and something to come back from C. So all of these messages in transit will actually get recorded to disk. Okay, so you have to distinguish between these two cases. The first marker that comes to you tells you to start and stop recording. So for that socket connection, there's nothing to record. But for every other socket connection, you actually send something out explicitly and wait for a reply to come back. Okay, so does that answer your question? Now, that said, the question is, will you actually get a marker on your incoming channel always that causes you to stop recording? That guaranteed.
So if there is a path from the starting node to all the other nodes, that's guaranteed. But if it's not the case, if there wasn't a path, for example, from A to C, I don't know if you perhaps could say that C is sort of independent of the rest of the computation.
Okay. So first of all, we are only going to do this recording for every active socket connection. If A and C don't communicate, there's nothing that they have to do with respect to one another. So the only two links to worry about are BC and AB. Okay? So the question is, if you send a marker out, will you actually get a marker back? Okay? If you just, and all you have to do to convince yourself is to only look at these any two pairs in isolation and ignore everything else. Okay? So if you send a marker out, then this process, if that is going to receive it, it's going to essentially send, because it does the same thing, right? It's recursively executing this. So once you receive a marker, you checkpoint and you send a marker out. So it is, every marker is going to cycle back and come back to you. Okay, so it's guaranteed that if you actually send something out, you will actually get something back on the return path, because that process will have to send you a marker. Either it has already received a marker from some other process and has sent it to you, or this is the first one and it's going to send it back to you, because it has to send a marker on every outgoing channel. Okay? So it's guaranteed that for every socket you will receive an incoming marker which will cause you to stop recording. If you can stop recording, you will terminate. Every process will eventually terminate the checkpoint. Okay, so it's, once you understand how the process works, it's easy to convince yourself that this, once you start a checkpoint, it will eventually end. You won't have a state where some process is recording socket messages on disk forever. In that case, there is no end to the algorithm. It will be an infinite loop. Okay? Now, I didn't actually convince you that it is consistent. I just said that this is how it works and it's going to terminate. But you have to also convince yourself that this is a consistent snapshot, which means it has actually captured every message in transit. No messages have been stored twice, okay, nor has any message been missed. Okay, you can convince yourself that no message has been sent twice, because every message that comes in is stored to disk. It's not getting resent here. Okay, and what we assume is if the entire set of processes restart, each process is going to start from where it left off, and any message that was sent is not going to be resent. They're just played out from the disk of the receiving process as if they actually arrived over a network. So you're just going to replay all of those messages. Okay. Should also convince yourself that you are capturing messages in transit which are precisely the message, the time between A took a snapshot and B took a snapshot. Any message that was sent by B are messages in transit. And this is simply ensured by the way markers work. So the A takes a snapshot, sends a marker, and until B is finished, it's basically sends some messages which are these. And then once it does finish, it's going to send a marker. So you're going to store a state of all the messages that were sent previously. And those are the messages in transit. It's a very intuitive hand-wavy explanation. It's not a proof, but you can actually write a proof for this. Okay? Okay, so that's distributed snapshot. A fairly straightforward technique. Okay, now a few things you should keep in mind. I already said that process is going to finish. You should also be clear that any process can initiate a snapshot. This works even if there are multiple snapshots in progress. Okay? All you have to do is for each marker message, you have to attach the initiator's ID, okay, and the sequence number of the snapshot. Okay? So you can actually have a scenario where A and C simultaneously start off independent snapshot algorithms. Okay? And the way you have to distinguish then is each marker message has to be tagged with, let's say, the snapshot number and the initiator. If you do this, then each snapshot is treated independently, so they all operate in parallel, concurrently. Okay, so you don't have to worry about messages getting mixed. Okay, each marker is tied to a particular snapshot. It's just a figure that shows how things work. So that's a process queue. It has some reason it has only one incoming and two outgoing channels. Okay, typically, if you're TCP, that won't be the case. In number of incoming and outgoing channels will match. But regardless, what's happening here is that's the marker message. Once this marker message is received, you're going to take the memory state, write it out to disk, and start saving and send marker messages on the outgoing channels here. Okay. And then if any other process starts receiving it, you're going to essentially start saving the messages. There are A, B, C messages that have been received until an incoming marker is received. Okay. Same thing that I showed on the board here is shown in this figure. And let me take a pause here for a second and see if there is any aspect of the snapshot algorithm I should explain. Okay. Notice that we have taken a snapshot without assuming any clock synchronization. Okay. The simple intuitive way to have done this was to have assumed that you have globally synchronized clocks, and you basically say every process freezes at noon, okay, some time t that is predetermined, and since all clocks are synchronous, every process pauses at exactly the same time and stores its local state. Okay. If you did that, then everything is consistent by definition because all snapshots are taken at precisely the same time. But because in practice you don't have synchronized clocks, you cannot make such assumptions. Okay. So this is the other way to ensure that you are consistent. Okay? Next question.
Can you elaborate more about the scenario when multiple processes start at
Okay. Question is what happens if multiple processes start a snapshot? Okay, what we want to do is if multiple processes start a snapshot, we just want to treat them as independent. Okay, so you just assume that A started a snapshot and ignore, let's say A and C start a snapshot at the same time. Okay, the way you want to treat this is A snapshot has nothing to do with C snapshot. So it could just as well be A started a snapshot, the whole thing went through, finished, and then C started a snapshot. This is how you want to treat multiple snapshots. Okay? The way you are going to do this is in reality they are not, in this case they started them more or less at the same time. So marker messages will get mixed up. Okay? So to prevent that, what you want to do is you want to take each marker message and tag it with the initiator. So you can say this is A's marker message. This is the snapshot that A started. Okay? So when you receive M of A, you will basically associate that with this snapshot. And when C starts it is going to send messages tagged with its ID. Okay? So you just have to treat them as two independent snapshots that have really nothing to do with one another. And the only way you do this is you don't want a marker message to come and then you get confused A's markers with C's markers. The way you will do that is you will actually tag the markers, okay, so that you can just treat them as independent snapshots. Okay, so it's almost as if A did the whole thing and then C started a new one. And that's how we want to treat them. Yes,
We
question.
we need special logic, right? For saying like, okay, I'm recording every incoming message except for these markers, which might broadcast out.
Right. So you do not actually ever you do not ever store the state of the markers. So when you're recording messages, any markers that are ignored, whether they are started by this snapshot, so they are thought of as control messages. Okay? So you only store data message. Any control message, whether it's a marker from this checkpoint, a marker from some other checkpoint, is always ignored. So that special logic is always in there. Even for a single snapshot, you would have to do that. Okay? Any other questions? Okay, so that's distributed snapshot. We will use snapshots to do something called termination detection. So this is a slightly different problem. The snapshot algorithm allowed processes to take a checkpoint so that if any process crashed, you terminate all the processes and restart them from the previous checkpoint. This avoids having to restart all the processes from the beginning and wasting all of the computational cycles they may have spent on processing something. Okay? Now we'll solve another problem. This is called termination detection. Okay? Termination detection basically says given a set of processes that are participating in some abstract distributed application, how do you know that the application has finished so that all processes can terminate? Okay? So we'll assume there is no coordinator that tells them that time to shut down, the server is going down or the server process is done whatever it's doing. Okay, the processes themselves have to figure out that the collective computation has finished. So is that clear? If there was a coordinator, this is non-problem. We assume that the coordinator knows what's going on, and when there is nothing left to do, it sends a message to all of the other processes saying terminate, we are done. Okay? But suppose there is no coordinator. How do the processes know that all other processes are done and it's time to finish? Okay? So what would we do? How do we know that processes are all done? Let's say there are n processes. What's the simplest thing you can do?
So you could use the distributed snapshot algorithm after you send all your messages. Then you can initiate the sending the snapshot, starting the snapshot, and if you receive the snapshot message from all incoming links before you get any other message, you could assume that it has terminated.
Okay. So that's a right approach, but let's start with the intuition.
Okay.
What are we trying to do? Okay, so how would you know that all processes are done if there's no coordinator? Okay, so you could use marker messages to say you're done. So there are only two ways to know all other processes are done. You ask them or they tell you. Okay, I'm saying very straight. That's not simple. I meant really simple. That's the only way you're going to figure it out, right? You're going to ask, I am done. Is everybody else done? Okay, if you feel a process feels that it is done doing whatever it's doing and it wants to know if it should terminate, the only way it can do is ask. Okay? Or you could broadcast saying, I am done, and then if everybody else also broadcasts the same thing, then you are done. Okay? Now, question is, how do you know that how does a process know whether it's done or not? Okay? And we'll say this because this is a very abstract way of thinking of what a process does. We'll say that there are two ways to figure out. A process is done if anything it wanted to do locally is done. There's nothing more to do. And then there are no other messages that are coming in that might trigger additional requests or computation. Okay? We'll assume that these messages that come in are essentially requests of some sort. Okay? Requests trigger new computation. So if there are any messages in transit, this process will have more computation to do. It will have to process these requests and they may trigger additional computation. Okay? So we'll essentially say a process is done if locally it feels like all processes, all requests that were outstanding are all finished, and there are no new requests coming in from any other process that's communicating. At that point, we'll say this process is done. Okay? And the computation as a whole is done if this is true for every process in the system, that each process is locally done processing all outstanding requests, and there are no messages in transit anywhere. If there are no messages in transit and everybody is done, then that so system as a whole, you can assume is done. Okay? So how do you ask processes and figure this out? Right? So that's basically what this process. Well, I mean, this is one way to do termination detection. Okay? So you could actually run distributed snapshots, as was mentioned. Okay? And what you would do is if every process declares after it gets a marker messages that there are no incoming messages at all, and every process has the same thing, and each process is done, no outstanding messages, you could say you're done. Okay? Or you could just send a broadcast and say, are you done or not? Okay? This is a very trivial broadcast-based marker process. So essentially, any process can initiate this termination detection algorithm. Okay? They're simply going to flood the network and ask every process, are you done or not? Okay? So essentially, there are two types of markers here. Okay? Done and continue. Continue is essentially I am not done marker. And done says I am done. Okay? So if a process feels it's done, it's going to ask anyone. It will just send done markers on the outgoing channels and wait for replies. Okay? This is the first done marker you have received. Okay? You ask your descendants in this graph, or not descendants, rather your neighbors in this graph, saying, are you done or not? Okay? So you'll basically flood the entire network using are you done queries, and this will basically form a tree. Yeah, that way the graph is assumed to be a connected graph. So every time you receive are you done from some process, you ask your neighbors, all the other neighbors saying are you done. Okay, the assumption is if you are done, if all your neighbors says they are done, and you are also done. Okay, so you wait for replies to come back. If one of your neighbors says they are not done, you say that one of my neighbors is not done, so I am going to assume that processes I know are not done, so I send a not done to whoever asked me. If everybody replies they are done, then you say and you are also done, then you send a I am done message. Okay? And that's it. So basically, you start this off by sending are you done requests, and when you receive this request, you send these queries on your outgoing channels to your neighbors. Okay? And you wait for replies. And if any process sends back I am not done, you send the same message. If everyone says they are done and the process is done, you send I am done. Okay? And this is what
you deal with cycles in your network.
Okay, good question. So because this is a graph, you don't want these to be cycling all the time. You should have asked that same question here because there will be cycles here as well. Okay, that's snapshots algorithm. So the way you have to deal with snapshots, cycles, whether it's snapshots or termination detection, is not keep on cycling my are you done requests. Okay? So you keep track of which channel has you gotten this request on, and you may send it on your outgoing channels. And if some process that is receiving it has already received that are you done request from someone else, you don't resend it again. That's the only way you're going to prevent cycles. The way you prevent cycles is you keep track of did I already see this message previously, and if so, I'm not going to send it again. Otherwise, you'll just circulate all the time. Very simple. Is that clear? What I said? So you can just create a cycle and convince yourself. So if you have A, B, and C, okay? If A starts this and it sends out, are you done, and B sends it to C, and A has also sent this on this outgoing channel. So C is going to receive 2 are you done messages. Okay, and after it receives the first one, if it takes the second one and keeps resending it, then this thing will keep cycling forever. Okay, so you have to keep track of I already received this, I'm going to ignore any further messages, just wait for my neighbors to reply to me. Yes, saying are they done or not. Yes.
When every process becomes stateful, right, it has to maintain some states.
Yes.
When there are multiple process initiated the termination detection or the snapshot request,
Yes.
then every process has to maintain a lot of states.
Okay. So every process has to keep state which says there is a termination detection algorithm in progress, and I have sent requests to my downstream nodes and I'm waiting for replies. Right? So here's an intermediate node. Okay, let's call it N. It has actually sent are you done request and waiting for a reply. The reply could be yes or no. Yes basically means continue, and no essentially says no means continue. Yes means yes, I am done. Okay. So if you receive yeses from everyone, so you have to wait for all the requests to come in. If you receive yeses, you send a yes up. You receive at least one no, you send a no up. It means continue. Okay. So there is some state which says there is a termination detection algorithm in progress. I have already received a done request. I have sent it downstream. I'm waiting for replies. And that's basically the state every process will have to keep. It's not a lot of state. The state is just you have to receive one request from every neighbor and keep track of what each neighbor has told you.
Yeah, but in the previous example, there could be multiple processes initiate the snapshot request. Right?
Yes. So multiple processes can initiate a snapshot. Multiple processes can initiate termination detection. Because each process asynchronously decides at any arbitrary time, looks like then I have not received any requests for a while, maybe there is nothing left to do, I am going to start this termination detection and ask. So even this there could be multiple in parallel. So every done message has to be tagged with the initiator's ID so you can distinguish. You are right. You may have up to n of these in parallel where there are n requests. N nodes in your computation, in the worst case. Okay? So and in that case, you will have n times the state of each algorithm. Okay, any other questions here? Okay, but keep in mind that we are just talking about receiving 1-bit messages from every process here. Okay, saying yes or no. That's a 1-bit message. Okay, and you may have some number of neighbors. And compare that to maybe gigabytes of RAM space you have actually used for doing some computation. So you're not talking about a lot of space at all. Okay? Next question.
So this done question mark message is just the previous snapshot marker, right?
Yes, so you basically have just made it look simple, but there are only 2 types of markers saying done or continue. So done is essentially a query saying are you done, or saying that I am done, and continue basically says no, as no.
How do you answer yes?
You can either send back a done, which is a yes, you can send back a continue, which says no. Okay, continue means continue the computation that somebody is not done. Okay, so it's really a 1-bit message saying 0 or 1, yes or no. Okay, any questions? Okay, so that's distributed snapshot termination detection. The next algorithm, set of algorithms we are going to look at are called election algorithms. Okay. Now, in election algorithms, the idea is that your distributed application or algorithm needs to pick one coordinator process to coordinate something. Okay, whatever it needs to coordinate for that application. In your lab, maybe you had a pig that was coordinating something. It was trying to figure out who has anybody been hit, or whatever it was trying to transmit the coordinates of the bird landing and so on. Okay. Now again, you could assume that the coordinator is hard coded by the application designer, okay, or the coordinate, in which case there is nothing to do, there is no election algorithm to run, or the processes collectively elect a leader, okay, or a coordinator. If you do the latter, you need an algorithm to figure out who is going to be the coordinator or the leader to coordinate whatever needs to be done. Okay. And if you use an election algorithm, the nice property you get is if the coordinator crashes or disappears or resigns, you can elect a new coordinator. Okay, because you just rerun the election algorithm, it produces a new result, and that process takes over as the coordinator. Okay. In many peer-to-peer systems, this is how you elect coordinators, because their peers come and go. There are rarely few static peers that you can hard code anything. So if there's some group of peers that are active, then they will collectively or self-organize and pick a leader. Okay, these are referred to as leader election algorithms as well. Okay. Question is, how do you do this? So if you remember, we already have seen leaders. So in the Berkeley clock synchronization algorithm, there was a time master. That was a coordinator. It was coordinating clock synchronization. Right? Again, that process could have been hard coded by the administrator, or all the processes can dynamically elect. Right? So I think I also mentioned when we were talking about peer-to-peer that in Skype, for instance, there is a notion of super peer. Okay? Super peers are actually elected by other peers or other Skype nodes in the system. Okay? They are not hard-coded typically. So these kinds of election algorithms are widely used for this kind of in dynamic systems, and we are going to see actually two. Okay? One is called the Bully algorithm, the other one is ring algorithm. So Bully algorithm is as follows. So we'll assume that all processes in the system have a numerical ID that's unique. Yeah, every process is numbered, and that we'll assume that every process has a unique number. How to assign numbers we are going to ignore at the moment. Okay, numbers don't have to be sequential necessarily, but they have to be unique. Okay? And for the Bully algorithm, we are going to essentially make a simplification, which is that every process knows of the existence of every other process in the system. Okay, so you know that there are n processes, you know the IP address of every process, IP address and port number of every process, so you can directly communicate. Okay? In large systems, this will not be true. Okay? If you are running Skype, it's not like you know the IP address of every other million Skype users that are active. Okay? They form a P2P network, they are not directly connected. Okay? But for this algorithm, we are going to simplify and say that processes know the IDs and addresses of every other processes. You can do away with this, but for simplicity, we'll just assume this. Okay? So the basic idea in the Bully algorithm is you are going to elect a leader, and that leader is the process with the highest ID that's active. Okay? Because their processes are numbered, we are going to by default say that any time you run a leader election algorithm, in Bully you will always find the process with the highest ID that's active and say that's the leader. Okay? So we'll assume like previously that any process can initiate an election. And maybe a process says, I haven't heard from the current coordinator in a while, perhaps the current coordinator has crashed, so I'm going to start an election algorithm. Okay, so any process can initiate this, and the way it is going to work is as follows. I'll show that on the next slide. There will be three types of messages here. Okay? An election message which says this is a new election, an OK message, which basically so what that means, an I1 message, this is after the election finishes, whoever has been elected, the leader is going to announce itself saying, I am the new leader. Okay? The algorithm is as follows. Okay? Any process P can initiate an election. The way you do this is you send election messages to all processes with higher IDs than you. Since you know the IP addresses of every process, you can broadcast an election message to every process that has a higher ID. Okay? The reason you do this is the outcome or the goal of the algorithm is to pick a process with the highest ID as the leader. Okay? So if a process with ID I decides it's going to start an election, in the optimistic case, it is going to be the process with the highest ID. There's nobody else active that has a higher ID. Okay? So the only thing it needs to figure out is there a process with ID higher than me that's still alive? If so, one of those processes will be the leader. Okay? So there is no reason to even ask any process with the ID lower than you. Okay? Because you know that among those processes, you will be the leader. Okay? If you are process 5, there's no need to ask process 4 saying, are you alive? Because you know you are alive and you will be the leader if you ask for anyway. Okay? So you only ask for two processes higher than you. So you send election messages to all processes with higher ID. Okay? And you wait for replies. Okay? And if a process receives this message, it has to reply back saying, I am alive. That's an OK message. And then basically what that means is it will ask P to drop out and you will recursively rerun the election. Okay? So P sends an election message to all processes with higher ID. If it receives even one OK message, okay, or more than one, then it basically drops out and lets the processes that have replied figure it out. Saying, now I know that some of you are alive, you go figure out who the leader should be. Okay? And then those processes are going to recursively restart an election until processes keep dropping out and there's only one leader left. So the reason it's called Bully algorithm is processes with higher ID are bully processes with lower IDs to drop out of the election. And so they basically try to get themselves elected as the leader. Okay. So if you receive an OK message, you drop out and you wait for the outcome of the election to be announced to an I1 message. And if a process receives an election message, it is going to return an OK and it's going to start an election. It is going to basically then ask processes higher than it and so on. Okay. And until only one process remains. So as an example here, okay, so processes are numbered 0 through 7. Okay, at 1.7 was the coordinator, but we assume it's crashed. Okay, so now process 4 realizes that the coordinator is not responding. It starts an election message. It sends messages to 5, 6, and 7. Okay, so those are all the processes with IDs higher than it. Okay, in this case, 7 is dead, so it's not going to do anything. But 5 and 6 are active, so they are both send OK messages to 4. Okay, 4 drops out. Okay, saying I'm done. And then 5 is going to start an election. Okay, and 6 also starts an election. You see that there's one election here, and then one election message going out from 5. Okay, 5 sends a message to 6. Okay, 6 is going to send a message back to 5 saying OK, because it's alive, so 5 drops out. Okay, 6 has also started an election on the previous slide, as you know here. Okay, but 6 just sent it to 7, which is not active, so it won't get a OK message. Okay. And then 6 wins the election, because it has basically the highest ID process. Okay, and then it sends a I1 or I am the new coordinator message to all these processes. Okay, so it gets elected as the new leader. Yes.
So you would need some sort of timeout mechanism because you're saying like, hey, 7's already there, and then you have to determine after some amount of time that it's not.
Yes. Good point. So this is something I was going to say, is that you have to wait until you receive an OK message, in which case you know that there is a process that is active, or you have to decide that there is no message coming back from 7 and declare yourself the leader. Okay? Now typically there are 2 ways to do this. One is you have a timeout and you wait for the message, and if there is no message that comes back from 7 after the timeout, you assume that 7 is gone down. You declare yourself the leader. Okay, but that raises the question of how to pick a timeout. Okay? This is a critical point in any distributed system, okay, which we'll come to in a few more lectures as well, is that in a real distributed system, there is no good way to distinguish between a failed process and an infinitely slow process. Okay? So there's just no way to distinguish. So let's say you pick timeout to be 5 seconds. Okay? And let's say 7 was actually not down, it was just overloaded and slow. Okay? And it replies in 5.1 seconds. But the timeout has expired. Okay? And 6 has incorrectly declared itself the leader. Okay? So there is no good way to actually make timeouts work, because really if the timeout is to distinguish whether it is failed or not and you're waiting for a reply, you can always construct a case where you pick a timeout and the process is just slower than that timeout. Okay? So timeouts are not a good way to distinguish. Luckily in this case, if 7 actually goes down, you will not even be able to set up a TCP connection with it. So you don't have to worry about a timeout in this case. You just try to communicate. TCP will return an error saying there's nothing on that port, and then you actually know that there is nothing to do there. But in reality, if you send the message and you're waiting for some sort of a timeout, then this can actually be a problem, because there is no way to distinguish between failed processes and very slow processes. Failed process is just an infinitely slow process that never replies. You can always have something that is actually going to reply after a very long period of time. Yes, question.
So this timeout that you mentioned is used after you initiate the bully algorithm. So another question would be, when do you decide to initiate the bully algorithm? Could you just use a timeout and see if you haven't received a message from the coordinator for a while?
Yes.
Then you initiate it.
So that's another good point, is when do you initiate? So I talked about timeout, saying that depends on who replies and after how long and so on. But you could ask the question, who can initiate election algorithm? So the assumption here is any process can initiate an election for any reason whatsoever. It may just say 7 has not replied to me in 5 seconds, I'm going to initiate it, or say I just decide to initiate it just for the heck of it. It doesn't matter. Okay? We'll assume that any process can initiate an election. Again, we can assume multiple elections could be in progress, in which case each of those messages have to be tagged with the election ID of some sort so you can distinguish. Okay? But the assumption is if a process initiates incorrectly, let's say initiates an election thinking 7 is done, but 7 is not, 7 will get re-elected again. Okay, so no harm done. You re-elect the same coordinator again, that's not a problem. Okay, so you could just initiate it and see. And then if the coordinator is still up, it will get elected. And if it's actually not up, some other process will get elected. Okay? And multiple processes could notice a crash of a coordinator can initiate election because it is distributed. So you don't actually leave the responsibility of initiating election on any particular process. Anyone can start it, and if multiple elections are in progress, again, no harm done, because each election should result in that same coordinator getting elected. Yes, in this case, 6 will get elected maybe twice. Yeah, again, that's not a problem. So long as the dynamics are not such that between the two elections 6 itself goes down, in which case a new leader will get elected. Yes.
It seems like if 6 did get elected incorrectly because 7 didn't apply for a long time or something, basically what happened in the P2P, in the distributed network is there's a leader role handoff that was happening from 7 to 6. If 7 did come up and 7 did apply, you could just seamlessly hand off the leader role back to 7. So the timeout mechanism, I'm not sure if it really matters.
So the another point being raised is timeouts don't matter because if 7 is just slow, then it can figure something, right? So that's good point. So let's ignore the timeout issue for now. Let's just assume a scenario where 6 did get elected, and after a while 7 reboots. Whatever the machine has crashed, 7 comes back up. What should happen? Okay? So 7 reboots, it could basically start a new election, and it will win. Right? So if any process comes up and it thinks that there is a lower ID process that actually is the current leader, it can run the bully algorithm and say, I'm going to take over. Yeah, because any process is allowed to start an election, in this case, including 7, whether it's slow or it actually recovers after a crash. Okay? So, and then if it gets elected the leader, then the responsibilities are transferred over. Okay? Any other questions here? Yes.
If it's very slow, it won't know that such an action is taking place. So it will think that it is the logic.
What's the question? If it's what is very slow? The leader?
7 is very slow.
Yes.
Everything is right.
Right.
So it will think that it's and the other one will also think that.
So you have to wait for either an OK message to come back before you declare either you drop out or you declare yourself the leader. Okay? If 7 and we didn't actually say that you will use a timeout. We are assuming that if you send an election message, the process is alive, then it will actually send back an OK message to you. Okay? And you have to wait for that OK message. It may take some arbitrary amount of time. Okay? For the OK message to come. If it's really crashed, it will not come back. And the assumption here is we use this protocol like TCP, you won't even be able to set up a connection to begin with. So there's no point in sending that message, will never go out. So you know that 7 has crashed. So in this case, we can distinguish. But in all of the other cases that you are mentioning, that is true. If you depend on timeouts, you can have problems. But the way we are saying the problem will be resolved is if some process sees a lower ID process being elected, it can initiate an election, or it can either live with that process. There is no problem if there's a coordinator that's running fine for it to have dropout. But if it believes it can be a better leader, it can restart an election and get elected. That's okay. Yeah, so this is the bully algorithm, very simple. Okay, and the other one we are going to look at is a ring-based algorithm. Okay, in a ring-based algorithm as well, we are going to assume processes have unique IDs, but we will assume that arranged in a logical ring. Okay, what that means is every process has 2 neighbors, a neighbor before it and a neighbor after it, and all processes organize themselves in a ring, 0 through n. Okay, so in this case, like the bully algorithm where a process needed to know every other process's IP address, here you need to know only 2 neighbors' IDs. You don't need to know every other process in the system. Okay, that's an advantage of the technique. Okay. Again, any process can start an election message. Okay. And the way you are essentially going to do it is you are going to send an election message. Let's say messages go clockwise in the ring. You just send an election message to the next neighbor. Okay. And as this election message circulates through the ring, each process that's alive is going to add its ID to the message. It's going to append its ID to the message. Okay, when the election message cycles back, okay, back to the initiator of the election, you see an IDs of all the processes that are still alive in the ring. Okay? And you just pick the max ID and say that's the coordinator, and you recirculate the results of the election. So there's basically a scenario here where 7 is gone down. Okay? So basically the rest of the processes here are going to start an election message. So in this case, we have shown a scenario where there are 2 processes that initiate an election, but that's okay. We'll see that they both result in the same outcome. So 5 starts an election, and it says this is an election message, I'm 5, sends it to 6. 6 appends his ID, so you have 5 and 6, then it goes to 0. 0 appends his ID, it's going to cycle all the way back. Okay? 5 is going to receive a list of all active processes, and it will discover that of the active one, 6 is the one with the highest ID. And it will say 6 is the leader. And it will send a new message that circulates through the ring, which says 6 has been elected the leader. Okay. Here is another concurrent election that was started by 2, same time that 5 started, and the same thing is going to happen. Okay, 2 starts an election, it adds its ID, it comes here, 3 adds its ID, 4, and so on. That message will also circulate. And when 2 gets back the results, it will see again 6 is the highest ID process that is alive, and 6 will get elected. Okay? Yes, question.
So you still need to be able to communicate between any pair.
Yes. So the assumption here is this is a ring. So each process needs to communicate with its. This is a connected ring. So there is an edge here, although it's not shown. Okay? So you need to be able to communicate with the highest ID process that has ID before you and after you. That's still alive. In this case, like 6 was initially connected to 7, but 7 went down. So you need to basically reform the ring and figure out the next process that you talk to is 0. And that logic has to be built into the ring. If you don't know how to talk to 0, the ring will actually break. Because when 7 goes down, you don't know who is your real neighbor at this point. So you need to be able to figure that. But other than that, this algorithm is fairly straightforward. You basically poll. What this is doing is polling all the processes and saying, if you're alive, tell me your ID. And then you just find the max ID and say that's the leader. Okay? Any questions? So we're going to do very simple analysis here. Just to compare, assuming n processes and single election. Okay, in the Bully algorithm, worst case, you have order n square messages. Okay, and this worst case happens when the lowest ID process initiates an election, and since each election is going to recursively trigger additional elections that are initiated by higher ID processes, you would end up exchanging order n square messages. Initially n minus 1 messages will go, and each process will send n minus 2, n minus 3 messages to all higher ID processes. Okay. Best case is when the highest ID process starts an election, it immediately wins and it just has to send n minus 2 messages to all the others saying I have won. Okay, so that's the best case. So there are 2 cases, the worst and the best. In the ring algorithm is going to be 2n minus 1 messages. Okay, the messages circulates around the ring twice every time for every election. Okay, first time you poll and second time you announce the results. Okay, so ring has more lower complexity than Bully, at least the way we have outlined. Okay, next question.
Why is the best case n minus 2 and not n minus 1?
Because there are n processes, 1 crashed already. So there's only.
We're assuming 1 crashed.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Okay, so you only have to announce yourself to the others. Okay, any other questions on this? Okay, so I'm going to say a little bit about elections in large-scale systems. So first thing is, so this is sort of coming directly from a discussion of Skype and super peers and so on. Okay, in real systems, there are many limitations that we have just ignored. We have looked at two very simplistic election algorithms, and we have assumed that in Bully, for instance, you know the addresses of every other node in the system. Okay, it's not a realistic assumption in real system where you may have 10,000 nodes or some very large number of nodes. Keeping track of every node is a hard problem. Okay. Second thing we have assumed rather naively is that any node can actually become a leader if it's the highest ID node. Yeah, this also assumes that all nodes are somehow homogeneous and have similar capability and have the resources to be the leader. Right? Becoming a leader essentially means you do more work. You do your normal work in the algorithm and you are the coordinator, so you also assume responsibilities of the coordinator. In reality, you may not want that. You may want to only elect leaders that have sufficient resources to do extra work. Well, like Skype is a good example. In Skype, if you are on a dial-up connection or you have a very low-end machine which is maxed out on its CPU, Skype nodes will not elect you the leader. Okay, so in this case, you are not only looking at the ID of the node, you also look at the resources available on the node. How much unused network bandwidth do you have? How much CPU, idle CPU do you have? So you want to elect a leader that may be the least loaded node in the system, not the highest ID node. Okay, IDs are randomly assigned. Okay, they don't actually give you anything, any desirable property. Okay? So you can think of tweaking election algorithms to elect a leader with the most available resources, okay, most bandwidth available. Because if the leader has to do a lot of communication, it better have enough network bandwidth to send all these messages. Okay? So you would have to then tweak the leader election algorithm to elect leaders with those properties rather than trivially a property that says highest ID. Okay? So in this case, the election algorithm, I'm not going to go into how those election algorithms work, but just you could come up with some simple straw man algorithm that says you poll everyone, you ask them for how much available resources, you can run the ring, but rather than asking processes to just give their ID, they could add also some additional information. These are the resources I have available. This is the type of machine this is. It's a quad-core server versus a low-end laptop. Okay, you could add those constraints, or not those constraints, but information, and have that message circulate and then pick a node that has sufficient available resources, the high-powered node. Okay, you could modify these algorithms to get better property of this sort, okay, which we have not assumed at all. Okay, the other thing is in many systems you don't have necessarily one leader but many leaders. Super peers was an example of this. Okay, in a peer-to-peer system, when you have clusters of peers, within each cluster there is one leader. Okay, but across different clusters there will be more than one leader. So in the whole system there are many super peers. Each super peer is a leader for its cluster. Okay? And you want additional properties that says the super peers have to be evenly distributed. Okay? If you have a global system, you don't want all nodes in America, for instance, to be all super peers, and all the nodes in Europe and Asia have no leaders at all. They all have to communicate here. Okay? So that to leaders that are far away from. So you want additional properties saying where are the leaders located in the network? Are they close to other nodes that are going to be coordinated and so on and so forth. Okay? So you will have to take these very simple algorithms and modify them suitably to actually work in real systems to give you better properties. Okay? We made some very simple assumptions saying all nodes are homogeneous, they're all identical, any node can be the leader, you know, nodes are numbered, you know the IDs of all nodes. None of those assumptions may actually hold well in practice. So you will see that this is and was a very active area of research. There are literally hundreds of papers written just on leader election. Okay? And leader election is just used to actually write your system and do something with it. But just on this problem, you see in all these papers, they just make different assumptions and come up with different algorithms. Okay, yes, question.
But it's still the assumption that there is one super peer that keeps track of all the nodes in the system. For example, if you join a new network, then you need to know who your neighbors are in the PDP network. You just can't go and discover some. You just can't go and ping random IDs to see that a Skype peer running on that.
Right. So there are questions. So I think the question that was asked really is how do you join a P2P network? Okay, you may or may not need a coordinator to join a P2P network. You can just have some very advertise nodes and you can flood the network and discover. There are many ways to discover. Right? This is not a discovery problem. This is basically a leader election problem. A leader election is just coordinating some task. Right? You could also have leaders that coordinate the peers joining and leave. That's a different way of designing your network. Right? But how peers join and how they leave may or may not be leaders. And you could do this by other means like broadcast and flooding, or starting with some well-known nodes and then using those nodes to discover other nodes, or many other mechanisms. Okay, so you will probably use leader election in the next lab, or really electing your coordinator rather than hard coding one. So you will have to make reasonable assumptions like what we talked about right now, just to give you a flavor of how these techniques work. So we are going to switch gears in the next 10 minutes, talk about one more problem. So we talked about sort of a variety of problems: distributed snapshots, termination detection, leader election. Next one is distributed synchronization. Okay, this is essentially, think of it as distributed locks. Okay. Now you probably know what a lock is. If you have a multi-threaded process with more than one thread, there's a shared data structure. You basically use locks to protect access to that data structure. Okay? You assume mutual exclusion, so before you access a data structure, you get a lock, you access it, then you release locks. This ensures that bad things won't happen when multiple threads try to muck around with the data structure at the same time and you get weird race conditions. Okay? So locks are necessary for any form of synchronization. Now the problem is, in a distributed system, you have processes running on multiple machines. Okay? Yet they may be trying to coordinate some task that requires synchronization. So how do you do mutual exclusion in this scenario? Where you don't have, if it's all threads in the same process, that's easy. The data structure is within that address space. You just implement a lock, and that lock controls how threads get to access the data structure. Okay, now assume that there is a shared buffer, but all these processes are on different machines. Okay, how do you actually use a lock in this scenario? Okay, so how would you do this in a distributed system? So essentially you want a lock mechanism that is generalized for a distributed environment. Okay, so we'll start with the simple idea, which is we'll use a centralized lock, but one that works for a distributed environment, and then we'll look at a distributed lock that also works for a set of n distributed processes. So centralized lock is very easy to implement. We will again assume that all processes are numbered. We will assume that you can run leader election and elect a coordinator. This is the lock coordinator. This is the process that's going to track which process holds the lock. For every lock that you want to implement in the system, you first elect a coordinator. That coordinator is going to keep track of the state of the lock and who holds the lock at any given point. So what happens in this case is very straightforward. Any process that wants to do a lock acquire is going to simply send a message to the coordinator saying that I am process I need the lock. Okay? Messages come into the coordinator, and coordinator can use whatever policy it wants to grant the lock. So simplest policy is first come first serve, FIFO. Okay, first process that asks for the lock, you reply saying, okay, you have the lock. Okay, then that process holds the lock, does whatever it needs to do, and then it sends a release message. Okay, and all other messages for locks are queued up, and then once a release message comes, the next process gets the lock, and so on. Okay, so there are two messages: a request message to request a lock and a release. So that's acquire and a release. So this is a very trivial implementation of a lock. So here you have four processes, 0 through 3. 3 has been chosen, the coordinator is going to coordinate the lock. It has a queue, okay, which is initially empty. Okay? So the first time, so in this case, 1 requests a lock, okay? And since the lock is available, it immediately gets the lock. You send an OK message, and 3 now keeps track saying lock is in use. The lock has been granted to 2, or rather 1. So if 2 requests a lock, that request is going to be queued up here. And only after 1 is going to release the lock, you take that queued up request and give the lock to it. So you just do some centralized coordination of this form and implement the lock. Okay. Now in this case, all these processes can be on different machines. You can just use RPCs or some form of communication to just request locks and release locks. Yes.
So locks are mostly used when you have a shared state that you want to protect from like too many things happening at once. But in this kind of system, you don't have shared state. So what sorts of things would you need to protect from?
Okay. That's a good question. The question is locks are typically used to protect shared state. Okay? So there's some shared data structure and threads are accessing it, you grab a lock and you basically modify that data structure only after your lock. And the point is, in this case, these are independent processes. So no memory is shared across processes. Okay, so what are we trying to protect? Okay. So although there is no memory being shared here, okay, the application as a whole may have shared state. Shared state could be any arbitrary thing. You may have records, like let's say these processes collectively implement, let's say, distributed banking algorithm. Okay. The shared state could simply be a record that says what is the bank balance for this account. If three processes want to actually access that record all at the same time, they have to grab a lock before they do it. Data may not be replicated, data may reside in any one of those processes, but there will be shared state. Memory is not shared because these are independent processes. But collectively, the application may store state for whatever it is doing. Okay? So in that case, you will still need locks. A distributed database is just a simple example of what their state might be required. Okay. Now, this is very straightforward, but there may be problems here if the coordinator crashes. Let's say the coordinator is busy granting locks and releasing locks, and something goes wrong and the process 3 is going to crash. You could simply say, let's run leader election and elect a new leader, and that leader is going to take over the lock. Okay, so you can do that and 2 will be elected, but there is a problem here. 2 has to figure out what is this current state of the lock. Okay, if the lock was already in use, you need to figure out which process has the lock. You can't simply start off by saying, I just became the leader, so I'm assuming that the lock is free. That may not be the case. Okay? And if the state of this queue was stored in memory of process 3, that state has disappeared when 3 crashed. So you have to, although this looks very straightforward, if you want to get it right, there are all these additional subtleties you have to deal with. The subtleties being, the state of the lock cannot be stored in memory that disappears if 3 goes away. It has to be stored somewhere on persistent storage. It has, maybe you keep a file. Okay? And then if 3 goes away, then 2 can still go and access the file, let's say. In that case, you can recover the current state of the lock. Right? But then you could say the machine may go down and the file becomes inaccessible. Right? So there are all sorts of problems to deal with. So if you want, because you cannot have a scenario where you say it's a lock and 2 processes have been granted the lock. Then the whole point is lost. That was the whole point thing you are trying to avoid. It is mutual exclusion. Right? So only one process can hold the lock. So this looks very straightforward, but getting it right, making sure it handles scenarios where processes can crash, coordinators can crash, is an important issue. Okay? So that's the crash of a coordinator. Now what happens if a process that's holding a lock crashes? What would you do? Okay, that's another interesting problem. Okay, this doesn't occur in a straightforward centralized process, right? Because threads that have locks have to release them. If they don't release them, there's a deadlock, and then you're done. The process doesn't work at all. In this case, if one was holding the lock and one just crashes, okay, the lock is never going to be released. What should the coordinator do? Right, so you cannot go back and say we'll use timeouts because you don't know if 2 is slow or 2 is just actually crashed. Right, so there are all these interesting problems that you have to deal with in a distributed system. Coordinator may crash, a process that holds a lock may crash. How do you recover from that scenario? If you wait for 2 to come up and it never comes up, then lock cannot be used by any other process. They're all waiting for the lock. There cannot be any progress in the system. Okay? There are no easy answers to this solution. Okay? So you have to make application-specific assumptions, saying what is the application willing to tolerate in the presence of failure. If there are no failures, this is not a big problem. Okay? Eventually, locks that are granted will get released. Processes may be slow. They may take a long time to release a lock, but eventually a lock will be released and other processes will have it and so on. Okay? But when there are crashes, this is a complicated issue. Okay, so I already said single point of failure. Detecting a dead coordinator is a problem. Detecting a process that has crashed is also a problem. Okay, so we could say let's get away from all this. Let's use a decentralized algorithm. Okay, let's not have coordinators that can crash. So we are going to use decentralized algorithm. Okay, here we are going to use the notion of voting. Okay, processes get to vote what to do. Okay, and you basically use the results of a voting. If there is a majority decision, then you say that's what is going to be done. Okay, so here we will assume there are n replica. Okay, each replica is a coordinator thread. It is not a coordinator process. We just assume that it either has a coordinator method, RPC method, or a thread within that process that acts as a coordinator. Okay, to acquire a lock, you need a majority vote. Okay, if there are n processes, you need at least the strictly greater than half the processes to say you can have the lock. Okay. So even if some process crashes, if the rest of them agree that you can have the process, I can have the lock, that's okay. So you're just going to assume that because you need a strict majority, okay, no two strict majorities can grant the lock to two different processes. Okay, that doesn't work. Right? If one half decides the lock should go to process I, the other half decides one lock should go to process J, but because you need strict majorities, not exactly half. Okay, there will be at least one process that is overlapping. It cannot decide that at the same time I and J should have the lock. It can only make one of those two decisions. So you will not go wrong by just going with strict majority. Okay. So basically you ask for a lock and then processes vote yes or no. If the lock is in use, you basically say no, that means you wait and you retry. Okay, if the lock is not in use, at least half of the processes are going to say yes to you. Okay, that's more strictly greater than half, and you can actually get the lock back. You just get the lock and then you release it. Okay? Coordinators can crash, but that's not a problem because they're using majority. That's okay when the coordinator comes back. You basically have to just deal with that scenario and you just recover from there. Okay. So I'm going to say one more thing here before we stop because we are running out of time here. There are two algorithms I wanted to talk about. That was the first distributed algorithm. The second algorithm essentially uses Lamport clocks. Okay, it uses the notion of logical timestamp. Okay, I'll briefly mention it and then we'll come back to both in the next class and analyze them. Okay. This algorithm is referred to as the Riccati and Agarwala algorithm. It uses 2n minus n messages. Okay. It is based on event ordering. Okay. This is where you use Lamport's clocks. Okay. So the way a process enters a critical section is as follows. It's going to create a new timestamp. It's going to tick its logical clock and it's going to send a lock request message to all other n minus 1 processes. Okay. And you have to wait for a reply from all of those messages, all of those processes saying go ahead. Okay, the reply essentially says go ahead. If all other processes say go ahead, then you enter the critical section. Otherwise, you wait until you have received all those messages. Okay, so what does each process do? When it receives a request, okay, if it itself holds the lock, it is going to delay the reply. So I'm going to wait until the lock, I'm done with the lock before I release. Okay, so if it's in the critical section, you queue the request. Okay, if it is contending for the lock, if it also wants the lock, it would have also sent a similar timestamp request. And it is going to compare the two, saying which of those two events happened before. Did I request the lock before or did that process request the lock before? Okay. And you are going to use the happened before relationship to derive an ordering, saying the process that made the request first as defined by the happened before relationship gets priority. Okay, if that process, if you can say based on looking at timestamp that process made the request first, it gets the priority, so you yield the lock. If you made the first request based on the happened before, you get priority and that process has to yield to you. Okay. It is simply used to, if there are multiple processes contending for the lock, you use happened before to figure out which of those actually made the request first and you assign them in that order. Okay, that's simply what this algorithm is. There's no contention, the solution is simple. You have the only process contending, everyone just says go ahead. Okay, only when there is contention, you have to decide which one gets to go next. And we use Lamport's clock to decide. Okay, so let's come back to this two algorithms next time. We'll look at some pros and cons of this technique.
Yeah, that's right. Did you realize any resemblance to what we did?